I know Tim wasn't feeling very well this morning. I would assume then that Donna's there looking after him, so hopefully they'll be okay. And of course, I think the Hegmans, are they still traveling tomorrow? Tomorrow they'll be back, so keep them in your prayers as well. Well, this morning we had a sermon really it was on James chapter 5 verses 7 through 11, but I decided to do that because it focused, or at least it mentioned, the character of Job. And so this morning or this evening, we're going to look at Job, the book, and survey that book and consider a few things that book has to teach us. Job really is perhaps one of the most mysterious books in the entire Bible. And I would, for my money, whatever that's worth, I think it is the most mysterious book in the entire Bible. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know when it was written. We don't know when the events took place. Some even question, and I'm not talking about skeptical scholars, but I'm talking about even some more conservative scholars on this matter, not even sure whether or not the events in this book even took place. We know precious little about this book, except for, of course, what's in it. But I do believe it is the most important book in the Old Testament, perhaps the whole Bible, when it comes to answering the question about why good people suffer. Why good people, the Bible often talks about why bad people suffer, right? But here's where we read about why good people suffer. What happens when good people suffer? This book, Job, begins what we call the books of poetry. We've divided up our Old Testament into 4 or 5 sections, depending on how you count. The first 4 books, Genesis through Deuteronomy, are books of the law. Genesis through Esther are books of history. Job through Song of Solomon would be books of poetry, sometimes called books of wisdom. And Isaiah through Malachi would be the prophets. Of course, you can divide that up with the major and minor prophets. That's where you get 5 divisions. The Jewish Tanakh, which is the what we call the Old Testament, places this in the writings. So there are 3 sections of the Jewish Tanakh, of the Hebrew Scriptures. And the section, of course, there's the Torah, which is the law. There's the history books, and then there are the writings. Of course, that doesn't mean that the writings don't contain history, because they do. As we can see, the writings consist of Psalms and Proverbs, Song of Solomon, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and the Book of Chronicles. Of course, the book, we would consider them the books of the Chronicles, 1st and 2nd. So, of course, it does contain history, this section here, but it also contains writings, what we would call sayings and things of that nature. So, looking at this book, how can we survey it? What are some questions that we might have? Well, we always ask, or we always look at the name first whenever we consider this survey. So, where does it get its name? Well, of course, it's named after the central character of the book. Of course, since we're starting the wisdom or poetry section, it is unusual for books here to have such a distinction. Of course, most of the time we noticed in the books of history that if the book has a name of someone, then that name is the central character of that particular book. Joshua, the central character is Joshua. Judges, the central character are the judges. That's not a name, it's a class. Same with kings, not a name, but a class of people. Samuel isn't strictly the central character of the entire 1st and 2nd Samuel, but through a good chunk of the book, that's the case. And so on and so forth. But in the books of poetry, this is the only one that has a name. Well, unless you count Song of Solomon. But that, of course, is centered on the song, not so much the name, the person. In any event, this is named after a person because there is a person who is central to this particular book, and that is, of course, Job. In Hebrew, the name is Eob, or sometimes Eov, depending on how you want to pronounce that last letter. Brown Driver Briggs, I know I have issues sometimes in class with pronouncing that name, the lexicographers there, but Brown Driver Briggs wrote it down this time so I could be sure. Says that the meaning of this name is unknown, but compares it to similar words with the same consonants, such as object of enmity. In other words, this is an object of hatred, an object of enmity. Or perhaps the Arabic, he who turns to God. Gesenius seems to agree, but says that that the root word, ayab, means persecuted. So we have that potential connection here. Now, the word, if it's connected to the word ayab, connected to that word for persecuted, then it could have, through time, come to mean that, right? Sometimes we have that, like the name Nimrod. The name Nimrod, or the when we think of Nimrod, if we don't think of the person in the Bible, we think of someone who's foolish. Well, the reason why we think that is because of Bugs Bunny, right? That's the reason why we think that, because Bugs Bunny would continue calling Elmer Fudd Nimrod, and that was because he's calling him that that hunter that we see in Genesis 10. So after a while, that name becomes something different. And that could be the same with the name Eob or Job. As we look through this book, it does carry the idea of persecution, that of a good man suffering for no reason, at least none that's apparent to him. The author and the date of this book, we like to consider that now. Again, we have no idea who wrote this. We don't know when it was written. There are some people who have ideas, but do we have any certain clue? Not really. The only suggestion that anyone has for who wrote it, that I've seen anyway, is a Jewish tradition that Moses is in fact the writer. That's interesting. If it's true, then that would make Moses the writer of 6 books of the Bible. That's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, along with Job, and one of the Psalms, Psalm 90. And it would make this having been written in the 15th century BC. But the language and content in the book suggests something entirely. It suggests something that is written a bit later on than that. Certain words and peoples that are mentioned, the Sabians, Chaldeans, suggest that it was written a good deal later, perhaps during the Babylonian exile. The content, however, suggests that it takes place in the patriarchal period. A lot of the chronologies that I consulted looking at this typically place this in the time of Abraham. And usually their reasoning is, well, he seems to be blessed like in Abraham's time, and he seems also to be making sacrifices apart from the Levitical priesthood. Okay, well, maybe around Abraham's time. I don't have a problem with it being written down around the time of the exile. That would be about 586 BC to 538 BC, especially since the first time that this book is mentioned outside of the book of Job is in the Old Testament, in Ezekiel chapter 14, verses 14 and 20. And he was a contemporary. He was someone who was writing at around the time of the exile. And he says, basically, he talks about the righteousness of Job, and not only him, but of Noah and one more whose name I missed, Daniel. Yes, thank you. Yes, because he's also named there in that passage. So Daniel, Job, and Noah are mentioned there as righteous individuals in the book of Ezekiel. The story may have come down through the ages orally, and someone was inspired to write it down much later. Perhaps they felt that this story would be lost if they didn't write it down. After all, this is the biggest event that has happened to them, the seeming destruction of their people, and they might not be sure what's going to happen next. And so they wanted to preserve this story and write it down for the generations, for posterity. But of course, God is the one who inspired the writing of this work. That cannot be denied as we look through it. Based on some of the names mentioned in Job, I personally think that it took place during the time that Israel was in Egypt. I could be wrong on that, but I think I have a decent case. So this would be before 1446 BC, but no more than a few hundred years before that. The reason is because there are Edomite names that are used here. Uz, for instance. Job from in the land of Uz. That's where he's from. We see in the first verse of Job. That's the place where he's living. That is in 1 Chronicles chapter 1 and in Genesis 36. That is an Edomite name, as are the names of Eliphaz the Temanite. Eliphaz and Teman are both Edomite names. So that suggests very strongly that this takes place in Edom. During Abraham's time, however, there was no Edom, because Abraham is Esau's grandfather, and Esau is the father of the Edomites. So it doesn't seem like that is during Abraham's time. It seems like it would be later. On top of this, the name Ram shows up, or Ram, if you want to pronounce it that way, shows up in Job 32, in association with a man named Elihu, the fourth person to show up and to talk to Job. There are only two other rams that are mentioned in Scripture. One is a name mentioned only in 1 Chronicles chapter 2, a couple times, just a random name that shows up. And the other is a descendant of Judah. We know nothing about, except that he was in the line of Christ, in the line of David. Judah, Perez, Hezron, Ram, Amminadab, Nahshon. We see that line, and we see that shown to us in the ending of the book of Ruth and also in 1 Chronicles. Judah and Perez are born before they go into Egypt, and Nahshon is the leader of the tribe of Judah when they come out. So everyone in between Hezron, Ram, and Amminadab were born in Egypt and lived during that time. Also, the only other Job that I can find in Scripture is listed as a descendant of Issachar in Genesis 46:13. But that name is also spelled Jashub in Numbers 26. I do not think that the book of Job, that Job in the book of Job is the same as this particular one, is a descendant of Issachar. But it does give us some idea as to the popularity of that name at that time. So, the primary audience, who is this written to? If it were written down during the period of the exile, then the primary audience would have to be the Israelites who were in the exile. While the majority of them were sinful and well-deserving of being in exile, many others were not, especially the children. Both Jeremiah and Ezekiel make a commentary on a proverb that had been popularized at around that time. Jeremiah has only a couple verses to that, Jeremiah 31, verses 29 and 30. But Ezekiel has a whole chapter dedicated to this proverb, and that's Ezekiel chapter 18. And that proverb that had been popularized at that time was, the fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. You know, it's a proverb along the same lines. You know, I remember hearing this, and I might have said it a couple times, in the playgrounds when we were growing up. You know, I'll hit you so hard your grandkids will feel it. Now, of course, I would only say that I didn't mean it. Wasn't really a violent kid, but I heard it several times. And so that's the same kind of thing, where you experience something, and then it results in your children or grandchildren feeling that too, or perhaps you blame your parents or your grandparents for a situation that you're in, and that's kind of what that parable is. That proverb is: the fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. Both Jeremiah says no more shall you say that. Ezekiel, again, has that whole chapter against that proverb. The soul that sins, it shall die. But the sins of the fathers shall not be passed on to the sons of this, especially in verse 20. Ezekiel 18, verse 20, that talks about that. Basically, sin is not inherited, but it's the soul that sins that will die. And the people at that time needed to hear a message like that, and a message about why good people suffer and what happens when they do. What should our response be? And we can see that in the book of Job. So let's consider that. Let's look at our outline here of Job. Job chapters 1 through 3. We find out that Job, as we start this book, Job is a righteous man. He's a good man. Married with 10 children and many possessions. We talked about that a little bit this morning. He even makes sacrifices on his children's behalf, just in case they were involved in some kind of sin. And then the Lord allows the adversary. Technically, that word there is adversary. We might have that transliterated as Satan. That's present there, and certainly that would be the case. Satan would be the one who would be in charge of doing all these terrible things that we can see in Job. And he afflicts Job, and he tests him, or at least the Lord tests him through Satan. Satan takes away all of his possessions, kills his children, and eventually gives him a terrible skin disease. 3 of his friends show up, and they do a good thing. They sit vigil with him and comfort him. We'll see just how well they comfort him as you go through the book. Then Job opens his mouth in chapter 3 after a good long while, talks about how he feels, that he wishes he'd never been born. And it certainly is. Job 3 is a heartbreaking chapter. If you read through that, the sorrow and the anguish is dripping from the words of that page, of that chapter. And it is certainly your heart goes out to Job for all that he's suffering. And one may wonder, have we experienced this? Has there ever been a time in our life where we could have said these words? And surely, I think many of us, we could. We wonder. He despairs of his own life. He wonders why he even survived being an infant. He wonders all these things about how terrible life is at this point in his time, all the things that he suffered. Grief isn't sinful, right? Grief, having sorrow isn't a bad thing whenever bad things happen. It's human. It's who we are. Certainly Job experiences that here, and yet his friends don't let him be human for a little while, do they? As we read through chapters 4 through 25, these chapters represent a cycle of discourses. Each of his friends takes a turn at responding to Job and his suffering, but they're not too nice about it, are they? One commentator suggests that these are in fact sayings, that they were sayings, or that these sayings were a series of proverbs that were common or popular at that time, the time that this was taking place. So these chapters represent the worldly wisdom at that time. That worldly wisdom is on display. These chapters would be chapters 4, 5, 8, 11. If you're writing these down. Chapters 4, 5, 8, 11, 15, 18, 20, 22, and 25. All these chapters are spoken by these 3 friends. And again, not too kind to Job. If anyone is trying to prove, here's one thing you might want to be careful of. If anyone is trying to prove something from these chapters, some doctrine or something, be very wary, because these some of the things they might be right in certain circumstances, but they're the wisdom of that time. They're being responded to, right? Don't take them as and don't use them for doctrine. That is not a proper interpretation of the text. Job offers his responses in the other chapters, in chapter 6, 7, 9, 10, 12, 13, 14, 16, 17, 19, 21, 23, and 24. So this is a cycle of 7 accusations, essentially. That's what these are, accusations. Accusations and responses to those. In these chapters, Job cries for a mediator in chapter 9 to make his case before God. He calls out his friends in chapter 16 for being miserable comforters, and pleads his innocence throughout much of this, that he is indeed a good man, not deserving of the calamity that has befallen him. Bildad is the last one, these 3 friends of his. Bildad is the last one to make a speech in chapter 25, and it's the shortest chapter in the book. And it suggests that Job is like, I'm done hearing you guys. I'm just gonna ignore you and go on. That's the sense that I get as I read through this section here. He ignores him, cuts him off, and continues on. Job speaks now in chapters 26 through 31. Job goes on to basically monologue for several chapters. This behavior, in my opinion, to be fair, seems unusual for real people to monologue like this. I heard one person make this point, and someone who believes this actually took place, these stories here, this story of Job here, but he pointed this out and said that he believed that Job was a real person and really suffered, that the speeches in this book suggest someone was making a play out of this situation, out of this life. Similar to Shakespeare and his historical plays like Henry V or Richard III. I don't know if that's right or not, but, I can't necessarily say anything against that. I always thought that it would make sense, at the very least, that this book could make a great play. And I'd love to see it performed. I don't know if I've heard people say that they've seen this performed as a play, and I think that'd be great to see. Maybe someone can do that sometime. Anyway, in Job's monologue here, he continues to declare his innocence, continues to defend himself, basically calling out the Lord for punishing him without cause. This causes one young man to speak up, and we see in Job chapters 32 through 37 that this young man, Elihu, unknown before this point, had apparently been listening this whole time to the whole exchange. And he couldn't stand it anymore. He had to stand up and say a few words. He hated how Job was trying to justify himself before God. Some people try to say that Job was sinless, but here is evidence that he did in fact sin in his attempt to justify himself before God. That wasn't his place. And Elihu declares that wasn't his place, and that seems to be corroborated by what God says later. And we can learn that it isn't our place to justify ourselves either, at least not before God. Elihu said that Job's defense was meant to be handled by someone else. Isn't that a saying? Someone who chooses to defend himself as a fool for a client? Well, in any event, that seems to be the case here. At least Elihu jumps up and says, I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to do this for you. I hear what these other guys are saying, and they're older than me, so I was listening to them out of respect, but what they're saying is not right. And Elihu is standing up to these folks to make sure that what's right is said. Of course, as we look at this, it's true for us as well, except our defense isn't handled by some young man like Elihu, but by Christ as our advocate with the Father. 1 John chapter 2 and verse 1. Chapters 38 through 41. After a few minutes of Elihu speaking, the Lord finally comes out of the whirlwind and speaks with a relatively brief response to Job. Speaks to Job for a few chapters, but we do see that Job responds in a few verses in chapter 40, first couple of verses there, that the Lord demanded him to respond. The Lord asks him unanswerable question after unanswerable question. Ultimately, we learn that the answer to the suffering of good people is not nearly as important as trusting in God. As you read through that, does God actually answer why Job is suffering? There's no answer. That's something we have to be comfortable with. Because sometimes there is no answer that would satisfy us at the very least. Or at least not an answer that we can understand. Not an answer that would make sense to us. Ultimately, we learn these things. God knows far more than we ever could. He knows far more than we ever could. We mentioned this on Wednesday, that God is omniscient. And as the creator of all things, he knows how they all work. He knows how they all fit together. His purpose for suffering is far greater than we could ever understand. Oh, sure, we could try to understand it, looking at Scripture and looking at the effect of suffering in our own lives. And I know people make some really good comments and statements about suffering and about, and I mentioned one of those earlier this morning, that we don't want to get too attached to this world. And that's what happens if we if we don't suffer, right? We get too attached to this world and all the things in this world, and we shouldn't be. We should be looking toward Christ, looking toward heaven. Ultimately, however, all that matters is trusting in God. He will see us through the suffering that we experience. Finally, see the intended end, as we read in James this morning, in Job 42. In this final chapter, Job repents of his trying to justify himself, and he recognizes the greatness of God and his purpose. The Lord demands that Job's friends repent of their lies about Job. And then the book ends with Job being blessed twice as much as he had before. He has more children as well, and if his daughters' names are any indication, they have helped to heal his broken heart, the loss of those that he'd experienced previously. The last point, whenever we look at these surveys, are the themes of each of these books. And I'm not sure how I can add too much to what I've said already, but I'll try to add a couple things. One of those themes is that good people still suffer. Suffering is not an indication that you have sinned. And the degree of one's suffering does not correlate to how terrible your sin was. Right? We see that, of course, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. None of us are deserving of heaven, and we understand the state of man, generally speaking, when we look at that. But Job was still a good man, and yet he still was suffering. He still was dealing with a lot. Sometimes good people still suffer. Now we know that, of course, all have sinned, all are deserving of death. But surely there are more people, or people that are more sinful than we are. And yet they seem to be doing well by comparison. You see rich folks, and you know they didn't get there by any honest means, at least some of them anyway. And you wonder why they're doing so much better than we are. This book tells us that we may not be responsible for the bad that befalls us, and we shouldn't look to others' suffering to gauge righteousness. In other words, that person is doing terribly. We shouldn't look, and we see that in John 9. Of course, I'm getting on a tangent now, but in John 9, there was a man born blind, and the people asked Jesus, "Hey, did this man sin, or did his parents, as to why he was blind?" It says, no, not for any of those reasons, Jesus says. Sometimes good people suffer. He's suffering this whole time for his blindness, but then the Lord heals him. He says, it's for my glory. It's for the glory of God that he's dealing with this. And so it shows his glory by having him healed, and shows that he has that ability to do that. Sometimes we see that it does show the glory of God, that he can bring us out of those terrible situations. How many times do you hear of preachers who, and I say preachers specifically because they tend to talk about it a lot, but they talk about how sinful their past was. And they might have been in prison, hooked on drugs, alcohol, all sorts of sinful things, and now they're a preacher. That shows the glory of God, showing that they have made that huge change to go from that sinful state in the pits of wickedness, and now they're declaring the glory of God. How wonderful is that? How wonderful is that? Another theme that we can draw out. Grief is real, and it is human. Some have the idea that living as a Christian, or obeying God will give us a great life, and nothing too bad will ever happen to us. Is that right? I'm here to tell you, and Job is too, and I'm sure many of you could say the same thing, that that's a lie. And in fact, if we live a Christian life, sure, there are some things that we will not experience as natural consequences of sin. For instance, we won't catch an STD, right? That's just not going to happen if we're living a Christian life and following Christian principles. But there are some things that we just cannot help. I don't like to give too many examples because I know we're all thinking about something that we've dealt with in our lives that we've suffered through, even while we were faithful to God. We've all been there. And if we think that we will never suffer things that are too bad as a Christian, what happens if and when we do? Our faith begins to suffer. And really, those tests should strengthen our faith. The terrible things, the things that we suffer through should strengthen them. There's always two responses. There's always two responses to suffering, and that's people turning away from God and people turning toward God. And that brings us to the next theme here, that we need to trust God through suffering. Our response should be to trust in God. One possible reason for suffering that this book teaches is to test us and to teach us. There are things out there that are far greater than the bad things that we experience. We need to trust that the omnipotent and omniscient God that we serve, we need to trust that He knows what He's doing. Job's first response after suffering such losses was to worship, as we see in Job chapter 1, verses 20 through 22, which the narrator tells us is the exact right thing to do. Of course, God doesn't give a specific reason as to Job's suffering. He doesn't give a specific reason to Job anyway as to why he's dealing with so much. First off, there's no guarantee that Job would understand it. There's no guarantee that we would understand the reason why we suffer. One of the reasons that we can see that Job is suffering, he's helping people thousands of years later when they hear this story. Of course, Job might be wondering if he heard that. What do you mean? What are you talking about? People are going to hear about this thousands of years from now and are going to be helped by it? That doesn't make any sense. At least it wouldn't make any sense to Job at that time. On the other hand, even if he did understand it, it would be specific to him and not necessarily benefit us. And that's the thing. We suffer, we deal with so many things. The reason why we suffer, or the reason why I might suffer, is probably different than the reason you might suffer. And it still teaches us something, it still helps in some way, but the ultimate reason could be different. And the Bible doesn't really tell us all the various reasons why that might be. It just tells us that we need to trust Him, that He knows what He's doing. That things will end up for the good, as we can see in Romans 8:28. Things will end up for the good, whatever happens to us. So not giving a reason for Job's specific case was the exact right thing to do. For our trust in Him is ultimately far more important than any possible reason we might receive. Suffering is terrible. I don't want to sugarcoat that. God recognizes that suffering is terrible, but He also recognizes the benefits to it. Otherwise, He wouldn't allow us to go through the things that we experience. I don't know, and I can't pretend to know why each of us suffer. But I do know what the Bible says about it. An example. What do we say? Many of us are married, have been married. What do we say when we make our wedding vows, our marriage vows? We say in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as we both shall live, right? What vows do we make when we become a Christian? Are we only faithful to the Lord when things are going well? In my experience, when things are going well, that's when people become the least faithful. Oh, things are going fine. I'm not even thinking about God. I'm just going about my business. Right? That's often when people lose their dedication to God. Suffering can help us by increasing our faithfulness and our devotion to God. I've seen suffering do both. As I mentioned, there's always two responses to suffering. It causes some to fall away, while others it tends to renew their devotion to God. What was Job's reaction? Well, he got closer to God, didn't he? What should our reaction be? He got closer to God and he was blessed far more than he was before. Our reaction needs to be the same. I don't know if we're going to be blessed twice as much as we were before here on this earth, but I do know what awaits us. We talked about that this morning, that the reward that we have in heaven is far greater than we can ever imagine here on this earth. As you're suffering, because we all suffer, I can't pretend like we won't or we don't. Has your suffering driven you closer to God? Perhaps it can bring you to obeying the gospel. I think everyone in here has done that and who is accountable, and that's a great thing. For those of you online who might be watching, perhaps the suffering that you experience, can it bring you to obey the gospel, to become a Christian, to recognize that there is a God above, to see that I need to do what's right, to give you a wake-up call and say, oh man, this terrible thing happened. I got to get right with God now. Perhaps, it's not just the non-Christians that need to experience that. We need to get jarred out of our complacency every so often as well. It can help us to repent and to do what's right as well. That's something we need to do this morning. Job is a great book to help us understand that and to help us to follow after him and to do what's right. If you need to do that this morning, if you need help in suffering and all the things that are normal to the human experience, whether for good or ill, please let us know about that. Come forward as we stand and as we sing.